The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Concluded. Michelangelo did not found a school as Raphael did, but he trained some distinguished artists and wielded pervasive influence. One pupil, Guglielmo della Porta, designed for Paul III in St. Peter's a mausoleum that could almost bear comparison with the tombs of the Medici. But generally, the successors of Angelo in sculpture and painting imitated his excesses without redeeming them with his depth of thought and feeling and his technical mastery. Usually, a supreme artist is the culmination of a tradition, method, style, and historical mood. His very superiority fulfills and exhausts a line of development, so that after him must come a period of helpless imitation and decline. Then slowly a new mood and tradition grow. A new conception, ideal, or technique struggles through 100 bizarre experiments to find another discipline, some original and freshly revealing form. The last word must be one of humility. We middling mortals, even while presuming to sit in judgment upon the gods, must not fail to recognize their divinity. We need not be ashamed to worship heroes if our sense of discrimination is not left outside their shrines. We honor Michelangelo because, through a long and tortured life, he continued to create and produced in each main field a masterpiece. We see these works torn, so to speak, out of his flesh and blood, out of his mind and heart, leaving him for a time weakened with birth. We see them taking form through 100,000 strokes of hammer and chisel, pencil and brush. One after another, like an immortal population, they take their place among the lasting shapes of beauty or significance. We cannot know what God is, nor understand a universe so mingled of apparent evil and good, of suffering and loveliness, destruction and sublimity. But in the presence of a mother tending her child, or of a genius giving order to chaos, meaning to matter, nobility to form or thought, we feel as close as we shall ever be to the life and mind and law that constitute the unintelligible intelligence of the world. Au revoir. It has been a profound and grateful experience to study so many of the phases and personalities of these rich and vibrant centuries. How endless was the wealth of this Renaissance, which even in its waning produced men like Tintoretto and Veronese, Aretino and Vasari, Paul III and Palestrina, Sansovino and Palladio, Duke Cosimo and Cellini, and such art as the rooms of the Ducal Palace and St. Peter's Dome. What frightening vitality there must have been in those Renaissance Italians, living amid violence, seduction, superstition, and war, yet eagerly alive to every form of beauty and artistry, and pouring forth, as if all Italy had been a volcano, the hot lava of their passions and their art, their architecture and assassinations, their sculpture and liaisons, their painting and brigandage, their Madonnas and grotesques, their hymns and macaronic verse, their obscenities and piety, their profanity and prayers. Has there ever been elsewhere such depth and intensity of yea-saying life? To this day we feel the lifting breath of that afflatus, and our museums overflow with the spared surplus of that inspired and frenzied age. It is difficult to judge it calmly, and we grudgingly rehearse the charges that have been brought against it. First of all, the Renaissance, limiting that term to Italy, was based materially upon the economic exploitation of the simple many by the clever few. The wealth of papal Rome came from the pious pennies of 1 million European homes. The splendor of Florence was the transmuted sweat of lowly proletaires who worked long hours, had no political rights, and were better off than medieval serfs only in sharing in the proud glory of civic art and the exciting stimulus of city life. Politically, the Renaissance was the replacement of republican communes with mercantile oligarchies and military dictatorships. Morally, it was a pagan revolt that sapped the theological supports of the moral code and left human instincts grossly free to use as they pleased the new wealth of commerce and industry. Unchecked by censorship from a church herself secularized and martial, The state declared itself above morality in government, diplomacy, and war. Renaissance art, the indictment continues, was beautiful, but seldom sublime. It excelled Gothic art in detail, but fell short of it in grandeur, unity, and total effect. It rarely reached Greek perfection or Roman majesty. It was the voice of an aristocracy of wealth that divorced the artist from the artisan, uprooted him from the people, and made him dependent upon upstart princes and rich men. It lost its soul to a dead antiquity and enslaved architecture and sculpture to ancient and alien forms. What an absurdity it was to put false Greco-Roman fronts upon Gothic churches, as Alberti did in Florence and Rimini. Perhaps the whole classical revival in art was a grievous mistake. A style once dead cannot properly be revitalized unless the civilization that it expressed can be restored. The vigor and health of the style lie in its harmony with the life and culture of its time. There was, in the great age of Greek and Roman art, a stoic restraint idealized by Greek thought and often realized in Roman character. But that restraint was quite foreign to the Renaissance spirit of freedom, passion, turbulence, and excess. What could be more contrary to the Italian temper in the 15th and 16th centuries than the flat roof and ceiling, the regular rectangular facade, the dreary rows of identical windows that stigmatized the Renaissance palace? When Italian architecture tired of this monotony and artificial classicism, it let itself go like a Venetian merchant robed for Titian in excessive ornament and splendor, and fell from the classic into the Baroque. Corruptio optimi pessima. Neither could classic sculpture express the Renaissance, for restraint is essential to sculpture. The enduring medium does not fitly embody a contortion or an agony that by its nature must be brief. Sculpture is motion immobilized, passion spent or controlled, beauty or form preserved from time by metal congealed or lasting stone. Perhaps for this reason the greatest sculptures of the Renaissance are mostly tombs or pietas, in which restless man has at last achieved tranquility. Donatello, try as he might to be classic, remained striving, aspiring, Gothic. Michelangelo was a law to himself, a titan imprisoned in his temperament, struggling through slaves and captives to find aesthetic peace, but ever too lawless and excited for repose. The recovered classic heritage was a burden as well as a boon. It enriched the modern soul with noble exemplars, but it almost smothered that youthful spirit, just come of age, under a falling multitude of columns, capitals, architraves, and pediments. Perhaps this resurrected antiquity, this idolatry of proportion and symmetry, even in gardens, halted the growth of a native and congenial art, precisely as the revival of Latin by the humanists impeded the development of literature in the vernacular. Renaissance painting succeeded in expressing the color and passion of the time and brought the art to a technical refinement never surpassed. But it too had its faults. Its stress was on sensuous beauty, on lordly raiment and rosy flesh. Even its religious pictures were a voluptuous sentimentality, more intent upon corporeal forms than upon spiritual significance. And many a medieval crucifix reaches deeper into the soul than the demure virgins of Renaissance art. Flemish and Dutch artists dared to picture unattractive faces and homely dress, and to seek behind these simple features the secrets of character and the elements of life. How superficial the nudes of Venice, even the Madonnas of Raphael, seem beside the Van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb. Raphael's Julius II is unexcelled, but is there anything in the 100 self-portraits by Italian artists that can compare with Rembrandt's honest mirrorings of himself? The popularity of portraiture in the 16th century suggests the rise of the nouveau riche and their hunger to see themselves in the glass of fame. The Renaissance was a brilliant age, but through all its manifestations runs a strain of show and insincerity, a flaunting of costly costumes, a hollow fabric of precarious power, unsupported by inner strength, and ready to fall into ruins at the touch of a merciless rabble, or at the distant cry of an obscure and angry monk. Well, what shall we say to this harsh indictment of an epoch that we have loved with all the enthusiasm of youth? We shall not try to refute that indictment. Though it is weighted with unfair comparisons, much of it is true. Refutations never convince, and to pit one half-truth against its opposite is vain, unless the two can be merged into a larger and juster view. Of course, the Renaissance culture was an aristocratic superstructure raised upon the backs of the laboring poor. But, alas, what culture has not been? Doubtless much of the literature and art could hardly have arisen without some concentration of wealth. Even for righteous writers, unseen toilers mine the earth, grow food, weave garments, and make ink. We shall not defend the despots. Some of them deserved a Borgian garroting. Many of them wasted in vain luxury the revenues drawn from their people. But neither shall we apologize for Cosimo and his grandson Lorenzo, whom the Florentines obviously preferred to a chaotic plutocracy. As for the moral laxity, it was the price of intellectual liberation, and heavy as the price was, that liberation is the invaluable birthright of the modern world, the very breath of our spirits today. The devoted scholarship that resurrected classic letters and philosophy was chiefly the work of Italy. There the first modern literature arose, out of that resurrection and that liberation, and though no Italian writer of the age could match Erasmus or Shakespeare, Erasmus himself yearned for the clear, free air of Renaissance Italy, and the England of Elizabeth owed to Italy, to Englishmen Italianate, the seeds of its flowering. Ariosto and Sannazaro were the models and progenitors of Spencer and Sidney, and Machiavelli and Castiglione were powerful influences in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. It is not certain that Bacon and Descartes could have done their work had not Pomponazzi and Machiavelli, Telesio and Bruno paved the way with their sweat and blood. Yes, Renaissance architecture is depressingly horizontal, always excepting the lordly cupolas that rise over Florence and Rome. The Gothic style, ecstatically vertical, reflected a religion that pictured our terrestrial life as an exile for the soul, and placed its hopes and gods in the sky. Classic architecture expressed a religion that lodged its deities in trees and streams and in the earth, and rarely higher than a mountain in Thessaly. It did not look upward to find divinity. That classic style, so cool and calm, could not fitly represent the turbulent Renaissance, but neither could it be allowed to die. Rightly, a generous emulation preserved its monuments and transmitted its ideals and principles to be a part, a sharer but not a dictator, of our building art today. Italy could not equal Greek or Gothic architecture, nor Greek sculpture, nor perhaps the noblest flights of Gothic sculpture at Chartres and Reims. But it could produce an artist whose Medici tombs were worthy of Phidias, and his Pietà of Praxiteles. For Renaissance painting there shall be no word of apology. It is still the high point of that art in history. Spain approached that zenith in the halcyon days of Velázquez, Murillo, Ribera, Zurbarán, and El Greco. Flanders and Holland came not quite so close in Rubens and Rembrandt. Chinese and Japanese painters scale heights of their own, and at times their pictures impress us as especially profound, if only because they see man in a large perspective. Yet their cold contemplative philosophy or decorative elegance is outweighed by the richer range of complexity and power, and the warm vitality of color in the pictorial art of the Florentines, of Raphael and Correggio and the Venetians. Indeed, Renaissance painting was a sensual art, though it produced some of the greatest religious paintings and, as on the Sistine ceiling, some of the most spiritual and sublime. But that sensuality was a wholesome reaction. The body had been vilified long enough. Woman had borne through ungracious centuries the abuse of a harsh asceticism. It was good that life should reaffirm and art enhance the loveliness of healthy human forms. The Renaissance had tired of original sin, breast-beating, and mythical post-mortem terrors. It turned its back upon death and its face to life. And long before Schiller and Beethoven, it sang an exhilarating, incomparable ode to joy. The Renaissance, by recalling classic culture, ended the 1,000-year rule of the Oriental mind in Europe. From Italy, by 100 routes, the good news of the Great Liberation passed over mountains and seas to France, Germany, Flanders, Holland, and England. Scholars like Aleandro and Scaliger, artists like Leonardo, Del Sarto, Primaticcio, Cellini, and Bordone took the Renaissance to France. Italian painters, sculptors, architects took it to Pest, Krakow, Warsaw. Michelozzo carried it to Cyprus. Gentile Bellini ventured with it to Istanbul. From Italy, Collet and Linacre brought it back with them to England, Agricola and Reuchlin to Germany. The flow of ideas, morals, and arts continued to run northward from Italy for a century. From 1500 to 1600, all Western Europe acknowledged her as the mother and nurse of the new civilization of science and art and the humanities. Even the idea of the gentleman and the aristocratic conception of life and government came up from the south to mold the manners and states of the north. So the 16th century, when the Renaissance declined in Italy, was an age of exuberant germination in France, England, Germany, Flanders, and Spain. For a time, the tensions of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the debates of theology and the wars of religion, overlaid and overwhelmed the influence of the Renaissance. Men fought through a bloody century for the freedom to believe and worship as they pleased, or as pleased their kings, and the voice of reason seemed stilled by the clash of militant faiths. But it was not altogether silent. Even in that unhappy desolation, men like Erasmus, Bacon, and Descartes echoed it bravely, gave it fresh and stronger utterance. Spinoza found for it a majestic formulation, and in the 18th century the spirit of the Italian Renaissance was reborn in the French Enlightenment. From Voltaire and Gibbon to Goethe and Heine, to Hugo and Flaubert, to Taine and Anatole France, the strain was carried on, through revolution and counter-revolution, through advance and reaction, somehow surviving war and patiently ennobling peace. Everywhere today in Europe and the Americas there are urbane and lusty spirits, comrades in the country of the mind, who feed and live on this legacy of mental freedom, aesthetic sensitivity, friendly and sympathetic understanding, forgiving life its tragedies, embracing its joys of sense, mind, and soul, and hearing ever in their hearts, amid hymns of hate and above the cannon's roar, the song of the Renaissance. Thank you, friend reader. This concludes the reading of The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, by Will Durant. This book was read by Alexander Adams. Additional titles by Will Durant in the Books on Tape library include The Age of Faith and Our Oriental Heritage. For additional information about them or for help with topics of related interest, please call our customer service department or check our catalog index to find review material. This audiobook may be purchased by you and donated to your local library for your friends and neighbors to enjoy. Such a donation qualifies as a write-off for tax purposes. Books on Tape Incorporated produces many new unabridged audiobook titles each month. Please call our friendly operators toll-free at 1-800-88-BOOKS for information about our service, or to set up a library donation, or to speed your next title to you without delay.
We hope you enjoyed this reading. Please continue listening to sample another Books on Tape bestseller.
The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This recording of the full-length reading of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan was produced in 1995 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. This book is read by Jonathan Rees. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This book consists of 14 chapters and is 482 pages long. Preface. The definite object proposed in this work is an examination of the general history of Europe and America, with particular reference to the effect of sea power upon the course of that history. Historians generally have been unfamiliar with the conditions of the sea, having as to it neither special interest nor special knowledge, and the profound determining influence of maritime strength upon great issues has consequently been overlooked. This is even more true of particular occasions than of the general tendency of sea power. It is easy to say in a general way that the use and control of the sea is and has been a great factor in the history of the world. It is more troublesome to seek out and show its exact bearing at a particular juncture. Yet, unless this is done, the acknowledgment of general importance remains vague and unsubstantial, not resting, as it should, upon a collection of special instances in which the precise effect has been made clear by an analysis of the conditions at the given moments. A curious exemplification of this tendency to slight the bearing of maritime power upon events may be drawn from two writers of that English nation which more than any other has owed its greatness to the sea. Twice, says Arnold in his History of Rome, has there been witnessed the struggle of the highest individual genius against the resources and institutions of a great nation, and in both cases the nation was victorious. For 17 years Hannibal strove against Rome. For 16 years Napoleon strove against England. The efforts of the first ended in Zama, those of the second in Waterloo. Sir Edward Creasy, quoting this, adds, "One point, however, of the similitude between the two wars has scarcely been adequately dwelt on. That is, the remarkable parallel between the Roman general who finally defeated the great Carthaginian and the English general who gave the last deadly overthrow to the French emperor. Scipio and Wellington both held for many years commands of high importance, but distant from the main theaters of warfare. The same country was the scene of the principal military career of each. It was in Spain that Scipio, like Wellington, successively encountered and overthrew nearly all the subordinate generals of the enemy before being opposed to the chief champion and conqueror himself. Both Scipio and Wellington restored their countrymen's confidence in arms when shaken by a series of reverses, and each of them closed a long and perilous war by a complete and overwhelming defeat of the chosen leader and the chosen veterans of the foe. Neither of these Englishmen mentions the yet more striking coincidence that in both cases the mastery of the sea rested with the victor. The Roman control of the water forced Hannibal to that long, perilous march through Gaul, in which more than half his veteran troops wasted away. It enabled the elder Scipio, while sending his army from the Rhone on to Spain to intercept Hannibal's communications, to return in person and face the invader at the Trebia. Throughout the war the legions passed by water, unmolested and unwearied, between Spain, which was Hannibal's base, and Italy, while the issue of the decisive battle of the Metaurus, hinging as it did upon the interior position of the Roman armies with reference to the forces of Hasdrubal and Hannibal, was ultimately due to the fact that the younger brother could not bring his succoring reinforcements by sea, but only by the land route through Gaul. Hence, at the critical moment, the two Carthaginian armies were separated by the length of Italy, and one was destroyed by the combined action of the Roman generals. On the other hand, naval historians have troubled themselves little about the connection between general history and their own particular topic, limiting themselves generally to the duty of simple chroniclers of naval occurrences. This is less true of the French than of the English, the genius and training of the former people leading them to more careful inquiry into the causes of particular results and the mutual relation of events. There is not, however, within the knowledge of the author, any work that professes the particular object here sought, namely, an estimate of the effect of sea power upon the course of history and the prosperity of nations. As other histories deal with the wars, politics, social and economical conditions of countries, touching upon maritime matters only incidentally and generally unsympathetically, so the present work aims at putting maritime interests in the foreground, without divorcing them, however, from their surroundings of cause and effect in general history, but seeking to show how they modified the latter and were modified by them. The period embraced is from 1660, when the sailing ship era, with its distinctive features, had fairly begun, to 1783, the end of the American Revolution. While the thread of general history upon which the successive maritime events is strung is intentionally slight, the effort has been to present a clear as well as accurate outline. Writing as a naval officer in full sympathy with his profession, the author has not hesitated to digress freely on questions of naval policy, strategy, and tactics. But as technical language has been avoided, it is hoped that these matters, simply presented, will be found of interest to the unprofessional reader. A. T. Mahan, December 1889. Introductory. The history of sea power is largely, though by no means solely, a narrative of contests between nations, of mutual rivalries, of violence frequently culminating in war. The profound influence of sea commerce upon the wealth and strength of countries was clearly seen long before the true principles which governed its growth and prosperity were detected. To secure to one's own people a disproportionate share of such benefits, every effort was made to exclude others, either by the peaceful legislative methods of monopoly or prohibitory regulations, or, when these failed, by direct violence. The clash of interests, the angry feelings roused by conflicting attempts thus to appropriate the larger share, if not the whole, of the advantages of commerce, and of distant, unsettled commercial regions, led to wars. On the other hand, wars arising from other causes have been greatly modified in their conduct and issue by the control of the sea. Therefore, the history of sea power, while embracing in its broad sweep all that tends to make a people great upon the sea or by the sea, is largely a military history. And it is in this aspect that it will be mainly, though not exclusively, regarded in the following pages. A study of the military history of the past, such as this, is enjoined by great military leaders as essential to correct ideas and to the skillful conduct of war in the future. The Influence of Sea Power upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan.
This concludes our program on this cassette. Please call Books on Tape Incorporated for information about it or any title we have recorded. Please wind the cassette forward to its end so it will be in order for the next listener. Thank you.